Hello, I'm Rebecca Wood and I'm going to be talking about the silencing and marginalisation of non-speaking autistic people, and I'll be suggesting some solutions to this issue. Now, autistic people with limited or no speech can be referred to as non-verbal or minimally verbal, which means having fewer than 30 functional words. Terms such as mute and disordered communication are also used, and these terms are all problematic in my view. From a developmental perspective, the term pre-verbal is sometimes used, and this of course suggests a kind of traditional developmental approach to language, but I don't think this has served the autistic population particularly well, looking at language from that perspective. Non-speaking, which tends to be used more often these days, does in my view suggest a little bit more agency. Now, one of the issues faced by non-speaking people is that silence and non-speaking is often assumed to be a place of non-meaning. We think of silence as being an empty space that needs to be filled with speech. We perceive of silence as a lack or the void in which speech occurs, the background or field that frames speech, as Aitchison wrote. Limited speech is often unthinkingly conflated with learning disabilities. Disordered speech is associated with disordered thoughts and a lack of understanding. And the communication of autistic people who are non-speaking is often shrouded in doubt, and the validity of what they do communicate is questioned. And many of these issues are also associated with a lack of agency. And assisted communication, particularly facilitated communication, has been dogged by questions about validity in a way that speech never has been. Fluency in speech, on the other hand, is associated with logic and sense-making. We assume an uninterrupted link between intentions and words. Language has traditionally been theorized as a window into a private realm of mental states, Muscat wrote. We assume that we say what we mean, that we mean what we say, and that there's commonality of interpretation. Now, before I go on, I want to say a few things about myself in relation to these ideas. So I'm relatively fluent verbally and in writing, and so I could be considered the wrong person to be tackling this issue. But I have had a lifelong interest in language and communication. I'm a parent of a child with dyspraxia and who has limited speech. My late brother lost his speech through illness, and he had previously been highly verbal and spoke several languages. And although as a result of this illness he experienced very significant physical disability, he was much more impacted by his loss of speech, something which he communicated to me virtually every time we met. And I saw overnight, as a result of this illness and the loss of his speech, a change in how he was perceived and treated by others. And so this presentation is dedicated to my brother Nick. I'd also like to say that both personally and as a researcher, I'm still very much learning about these issues myself. So really these are ideas which are in process and certainly not intended to preach in any way. Now, non-speaking people can be excluded from research due to low test scores, for example, on the ADOS or the Vineland. And when they are included in research, particularly in more scientific, medical or intervention type research studies, they tend to be objects of study, subject to interventions and third-party report. In other words, they're sort of ghostly presences summarized by test scores and defined by the words of others. And there's often a real lack of nuance in these sorts of accounts. Little account is taken of broader environmental circumstances that can impact on communication, or indeed on test scores. And this includes, of course, the presence of researchers. Cultural issues, including multilingualism, are rarely taken into account. And in more qualitative studies, the lack of inclusion of non-speaking autistic people is often an acknowledged limitation, although actually in some studies it's not even in there as a limitation. And when it is acknowledged as a limitation, it doesn't stop the next research study proceeding on exactly the same basis. And we have over recent years seen an increase in the concept of autistic participation, both in practice and in research. And while of course this is to be welcomed, and there's obviously a lot more work that needs to be done, there has been a focus on the verbal population predominantly. And there are also subtle exclusions in assertions of participatory intent, particularly in relation to children's research. Terms like child voice, listening to the voice of, actually reinforces the emphasis on speech and therefore inadvertently ends up subtly excluding individuals who are non-speaking. Now, in terms of interventions for speech and language, there's been a huge amount of research in this area, but actually positive outcomes are notoriously difficult to ascertain, predominantly because of the high number of variables that are at play. Now, Brignall et al. In the Cochrane Review, so the Cochrane reviews really are the gold standard of systematic reviews. They carried out a systematic review of interventions for minimally verbal children, and they found that there was a real lack of evidence for the effectiveness of these communication interventions. And so despite the lack of evidence for the effectiveness of a range of interventions, they do continue apace. And I mentioned earlier the word functional and said that I would return to that. In terms of support and interventions for people who have a small amount of speech or who are entirely non-speaking, they are often only supported to request the basics, such as food and drink or going to the loo or something like that. So of course this is exceptionally limited, not being supported to request thoughts, ideas, hopes, dreams, needs, wants on a broader sense, and interests. And so what can happen in these situations is that communication support becomes a kind of communication prison. And in my own school-based research, when I was looking in part at interventions for children with communication difficulties, autistic children with communication difficulties, I found that children were sometimes only supported in their communication if it conformed with adult intentions. In fact, sometimes their communication was only validated when it corresponded with those intentions. The whole purpose of the communication support was sometimes to achieve that conformity. And children, the autistic children in my study, were sometimes perceived as being disordered and even feral, rather disruptive presences in the schools. And so the purpose of the communication support was in fact to tame and civilize that child. And another broader issue that can happen, particularly in practice settings, is that when interventions are not effective, the intervention itself is not questioned. It's just seen as an indication of how difficult or disordered or whatever the child might be. Now, Bradshaw and others looked at the use of communication passports in residential settings, and they found there was very limited use of alternative and augmentative communication systems, so AAC devices. Many interactions were in fact only verbal. And interestingly, individuals with verbal communication skills actually received better support for communication. And as always, these limitations mean that participants have little choice over activities. Always these problems impact on agency and choice. Now, at a conference I organised in 2019 called How I Communicate, it was a conference focused on autism and communication, Marion Hurst said that AAC devices are often not designed with the input of end users. And so the result is cluttered screens and devices with very complex functionalities that not only can the individual who's supposed to use them not work out, but the people supporting them too. And so she said often they end up limiting opportunities, not extending them. And Sarah Playforth, who is deaf, spoke about the extreme fatigue for deaf people when they are having to constantly adapt to the communication of others. And I think this is a really important issue. We often think in terms of the communication dynamic that you have a therapist who is providing support to an impaired individual. But we actually don't focus enough on the extreme fatigue that non-speaking autistic people might experience when they're constantly having to adapt to the communication that other people use. Another aspect that came out of my PhD is that, of course, speech is not necessarily valuable. One of my autistic adult participants wrote about the need to fill silences, the need to talk for the sake of it, nice speak, people who don't say what they mean or don't worry about the quality or accuracy of what they called fluffy chat. And I also think it's a mistake to consider that all non-speaking people are disempowered. There were certainly examples in my PhD of autistic children, including those described as nonverbal, who were claiming agency. So, for example, a child who I called Bobby was asked repeatedly by his teaching assistant to colour in a horse on a sheet that had many animals on it. And in fact, Bobby coloured in all of the animals except the horse. And another boy who I called Rashan, he was actually verbal. He spoke more than one language, in fact, but he didn't want to do an interview. He asked me instead to video record him doing action hero moves, which he had invented. And my brother Nick was supposed to sign in and out of his care home, but he never did. He would just sail in and out in his electric wheelchair, refusing to sign. In fact, Aitchison wrote that silences can be situated, embodied practices, which can be gestures. And she said we must escape the binary of speech and silence and understand silence in its communicative fullness. So in my view, all autism research should take account to one degree or another of non-speaking autistic people. It's really not good enough for autistic people who are non-speaking to be banished perpetually to the limitations section. We need to broaden our concept of autistic participation, and that also includes reliance on writing or typing, because not all autistic people are able to access this. And so there needs to be a recognition at the planning stages of research that this takes time. And this can actually be contrary to the emphasis on results and outputs that really dominates the research field. We need a critical analysis of the role of gatekeepers. In my experience, gatekeepers are people who support autistic people or people who provide permissions for access, can be both enablers and preventers. There should be a recognition too that non-speaking autistic people might not deliver data in the ways that we want or expect. We must explore multimodal forms of communication and ethnographic approaches, and think about participation of non-speaking autistic people at all stages of the research process. As far as interventions are concerned, we need to reconsider the concept of functionality and to think about it much more broadly. What matters is the function for the individual. One example is echolalia, for example, which has now been found to be a stepping stone to speech, or it can simply have a processing value, or perhaps it's just simply to do with the aesthetics of repeating a word. And this includes the category of individuals who are described as minimally verbal, who have 30 or fewer words. The important question to ask is, how valuable are those words to the individual? Why have those words been chosen? Because typically this descriptor is used to indicate an inability to use more than 30 words. Well, on a certain level that might be true, but actually I think it's also worth looking at what those 30 words are and what they tell us about what that individual finds important. We need to think carefully about assessments that can be based on neuronormative concepts. I remember seeing a speech and language therapy assessment once which had several bears carrying out different actions, and an autistic boy was asked to point to a bear who was drinking lemonade. And this boy was very much a literal thinker, and so he was completely flummoxed by this question. The role of a speech and language therapist is to support what the individual wants to communicate, and in school settings that's got to include things that the adults really might not want to hear. The concept of free speech must not be abandoned here. We need to focus on the interactive, shared nature of communication and understand communication as an embodied relational process, including stimming, for example. I think that assessments should be multi-layered and take into account environmental and contextual factors when it comes to involving non-speaking autistic people in research. We should also consider more visual approaches such as the Raven's progressive matrices. Assessments should be linked to an individual's interests and thinking style. And in terms of research, we need to be supporting organisations like Communication First or Boing Boing and include them as part of the research process on a paid basis. In terms of practice, I would strongly recommend the recommendations from the National Autistic Task Force report, which has got an excellent section on communication. And we need to consider incorporating expertise from other communities, such as the deaf community. we need values-driven, not results-driven research. And so involving non-speaking autistic people in research projects might mean rethinking the aims of autism communication research. And above all, we must avoid the perception that non-speaking or silence is non-communication or a space of non-meaning. And this is a picture of myself and my brother. Thank you very much for listening. And here are some references if that is of interest to you.